The lead squads of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division were already past the tree line when the first bullet found them. How does a road that intelligence promised was open turn into a killing field before breakfast? Why did an entire regiment of German paratroopers, part of Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army, spend an entire day stalled in front of one Belgian village? And who exactly was up on that ridge doing the killing? Dawn on December 16, 1944. The Losheim Gap, a corridor of low hills and thin forest on the German-Belgian border, the same ground armies had poured through in 1914 and 1940. Colonel Helmut von Hoffmann's men moved up the frozen road toward a hamlet called Lanzerath, and they moved with the confidence of soldiers who had been told the hard part belonged to someone else. The artillery had already spoken. For roughly half an hour before first light, German guns had walked shells across the American positions, and the paratroopers watching from the assembly area assumed the barrage had done its work. The plan handed down through Dietrich's headquarters treated this sector as a seam, a soft place where the American line barely existed. Kampfgruppe Peiper, the armored spearhead meant to race for the Meuse, was waiting on these very paratroopers to punch the hole. They were young. Many of them had never jumped from an aircraft in their lives. The Fallschirmjäger by late 1944 were paratroopers in name and unit patch only, ground infantry filled out with Luftwaffe personnel who had no planes left to service. What they had was numbers, momentum, and orders that told them to keep moving no matter what stood ahead. I'm still digging into the next stretch of this fight, so subscribe and stay close, because the part where Peiper's tanks arrive is worth the wait. If you know one of these paratroopers' names or carry a family account from the Losheim Gap, put it in the comments and hit like so the algorithm shows this to the people who care about it. What those young men did not know was that the barrage had missed. It had landed on empty ground and on the village behind the ridge, not on the 18 Americans dug in on the high slope overlooking the road. 18. That is the number the records settle on, though a few accounts push it to 19. An Intelligence and Reconnaissance platoon from the 99th Infantry Division, led by a 20-year-old first lieutenant named Lyle Bouck, reconnaissance troops. This was no line-holding unit, no crew of engineers with prepared strongpoints, no company with mortars zeroed in and machine guns interlocked across a mapped field of fire. A scout platoon that had been shoved onto this hill almost as an afterthought, and that morning found itself sitting directly astride the road every German commander in the sector needed. The whole story turns on the collision that followed. Von Hoffmann's regiment, 500 paratroopers strong by most counts, expected to walk through Lanzerath and hand a clean road to the armor behind them, trusting that the artillery had cleared it and the seam lay empty because the maps and the plan and the whole architecture of the Ardennes offensive told them it would. Instead, they walked into 18 dug-in Americans with a single 50 caliber machine gun, a clear view of the approach, and no intention of leaving. The result was the opposite of everything the German timetable required. A day meant to end with Peiper, miles to the west, ended with his column jammed behind a village that would not fall. The men who were supposed to open the door became the reason it stayed shut. To understand how 18 scouts held a ridge against 500 paratroopers through an entire December day, you have to go back to who those Americans actually were, and to the foxholes they had been digging for weeks before anyone told them a war was coming down that road. So how does a 20-year-old end up commanding the platoon that stands between Germany and the Meuse? Lyle Bouck had enlisted in the Missouri National Guard at 14, lying about his age, and by 1944, he had spent more of his short life in uniform than most of the men he led. He built the I&R platoon of the 394th Infantry Regiment, the way a careful man builds anything he expects to depend on, choosing each man deliberately. Intelligence and reconnaissance work meant small teams operating forward of the line, reading terrain, counting the enemy, and getting home to tell somebody, and Bouck wanted men who could think when the plan fell apart. His platoon trained harder than the rifle companies, ran more patrols, spent more nights out in the cold, learning the ground. By December, they knew the approaches to Lanzerath better than the officers who had assigned them there. The Losheim Gap itself was the problem the whole American line preferred not to look at. Roughly a mile and a half of open corridor, it fell on the boundary between two divisions, the 99th to the north and the 14th Cavalry Group screening south of it. Boundaries are always the weak seam in a defensive line because responsibility blurs exactly where the map lines meet, and neither commander owns the gap the way he owns his own frontage. American planners knew the gap was thin. They accepted it. The Ardennes as a whole was the quiet sector, the place green divisions were sent to learn the trade, and tired ones were sent to rest, and the assumption running through 1st Army headquarters held that the terrain itself did the defending. Steep, wooded, cut by narrow roads. Bad country for tanks, the reasoning went, so a light screen would do. The German High Command read the same terrain and reached the opposite conclusion. Hitler's staff chose the Ardennes precisely because it was lightly held, and the Losheim Gap because it offered Peiper the fastest road west. Where the Americans saw ground too rough to bother defending in strength, the Germans saw a door left unlocked. Bouck's men occupied foxholes on the ridge above Lanzerath that had been dug by cavalry troopers before them, positions overlooking the road that ran up from Losheim toward the village and on toward the Meuse beyond. 18 men, give or take, a 50 caliber machine gun, rifles, a few automatic weapons, a radio that would carry their reports back to a regiment that could offer them almost nothing in return. This was a screening force, a tripwire, men meant to see the enemy and report, not to fight a regiment to a standstill. I think the word that fits their situation best is expendable, and I don't mean that unkindly. A recon screen exists to be hit. It buys information with its own exposure. Nobody up the chain expected 18 scouts on that ridge to change the shape of the offensive, because 18 scouts are not supposed to be able to. The German plan was built on that assumption. Von Hoffmann's paratroopers had orders to move through Lanzerath and keep moving, on the understanding that whatever thin American presence remained would fold or flee once the guns opened. The seam would give, the road would open. Peiper's armor, waiting behind them, with the whole weight of the 6th Panzer Army's schedule pressing down, would surge through and be at the river in short order. Every part of that reasoning was sound, except for one detail nobody had entered into the plan. The men on the ridge had spent weeks learning exactly this ground. They had a clear field of fire down the only road the Germans intended to use, and their commander was not the kind of officer who ran on being told the enemy was coming. On the morning of December 16th, the assumption that no one would seriously defend the Losheim Gap was about to meet the one platoon prepared to do precisely that. The foxholes on Lanzerath Ridge were good, and that mattered more than anyone at the time understood. The cavalry troopers who dug them had done the work right, cutting them deep into the reverse slope so a man could stand in one to fire and dropped below the lip when the return came. Bouck's platoon improved on what they inherited, deepening the holes, laying in logs overhead, sighting the .50 caliber where it could sweep the road at the point the ground funneled the traffic. They had communication wires strung between positions. They had registered the ground in their heads through weeks of standing in it. When you spend enough nights in a hole, you stop guessing at distances and start knowing them. And by mid-December, these men knew exactly how far the tree line sat from the .50 and how long a running man took to cross the open. The cold did the rest of the preparing for them. Belgian winter in the Ardennes settled into the low 20s and lower, and the ground had frozen hard enough that digging became work for a pick rather than a shovel. Frost on the pine, the smell of it thin and sharp in the dark, breath hanging in front of a man's face and then gone. The scouts had been in these holes long enough to hate them and to trust them at the same time. That was the American side of the ledger: discipline, terrain, and a screen of men who had made peace with the ridge. The German timetable had no comparable margin. Everything about the Ardennes offensive depended on speed, on Peiper reaching the Meuse bridges before the American command could react and choke the corridor with reserves, and Peiper's schedule was measured in hours, not days. The paratroopers moving up in the dark carried the first hour of that schedule on their shoulders. Their job was to clear Lanzerath and the ridge behind it fast enough that the armor stacked up on the roads to the east could roll without stopping. Delay anywhere in the line rippled backward through every unit waiting its turn on the same narrow tracks. The 6th Panzer Army had been given the shortest, most direct axis of the whole attack, and Dietrich's staff had built the plan around the assumption that the opening moves would go quickly because there was nothing serious in the way. Von Hoffmann's regiment believed that too. Why wouldn't they? The artillery had gone in before dawn. The maps showed a thin American screen at best, and the whole architecture of the operation told these men the road ahead was theirs. Pre-dawn on the ridge was silent, in the way that stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling like a held breath. The scouts had watched lights and movement to the east in the days before, small signs that the quiet sector was not as quiet as headquarters insisted, and Bouck had reported what he saw and been told to hold his position. So he held it. His men stood their watch in the cold and listened to nothing, and there is no worse thing to listen to when you know something is coming, waiting on a morning that everyone above them had promised would stay dull. The barrage that opened before first light told them the promise was broken. It fell heavy, and it fell wrong, chewing the empty ground and the village rather than the ridge, and when it lifted, the scouts were still in their holes, with the .50 intact and the road below them exactly as they had memorized it. The German artillery had failed to find the American positions, and the whole day turned on that. The men who were supposed to be dead or scattered were neither. They were dug in, warm enough to work a trigger, and looking straight down, the only road 500 paratroopers intended to walk up. And the paratroopers came on, believing the hard part was already finished. A well-sighted machine gun on good ground is worth a company of infantry, went the old infantry maxim, and on the morning of December 16th and 9th, Fallschirmjäger Regiment was about to prove it the hard way. The regiment came up the road in something close to a column, then spread into skirmish lines as the ground opened, and it came on the way German infantry had been trained to come on since the earliest days of the war. Move, find the enemy, press him, overwhelm the point of resistance with weight and momentum. Against a folding screen, the method worked. Against 18 men who did not fold, it fed bodies into a killing ground, one wave at a time. The problem was doctrine meeting terrain that punished it. The road up from Losheim funneled the paratroopers into open ground below the ridge, and the scouts had memorized every yard of it. Bouck's men held their fire until the range closed to something they could not miss. That is the discipline recon training buys, and that a green rifle company usually lacks. The willingness to let the enemy walk deep into the trap before the first round leaves the barrel. When the .50 caliber opened, it swept the road at the point the platoon had chosen weeks earlier, and the rifles came in behind it, across a field of fire that had been worked out in daylight and rehearsed in the head 100 times. American marksmanship in 1944 gets less credit than it deserves. These men could hit what they aimed at, and they aimed at paratroopers crossing frozen open ground with no cover worth the name. The Fallschirmjäger doctrine had an answer for a strong point, and the answer was to work around the flanks and take it from a direction it could not cover. Sound tactics. But the flanks here ran into more of the same prepared ground, and every attempt to shift left or right put the paratroopers back into the .50's arc or into rifle fire from a hole they had not spotted. So they resorted to the option that costs the most and gains the least, and came again up the middle. Von Hoffman's regiment attacked frontally, repeatedly, into a fixed position sighted to break exactly that kind of attack. I think this is the part of Lanzerath that gets flattened in the retelling, so I want to be precise about it. 18 men do not stop 500 with courage alone. They stop them with terrain chosen for the fight, with weapons sighted to cover the only approach, with fire discipline that wastes nothing, and with the plain fact that a man crossing open ground on his feet is at a lethal disadvantage against a man firing from a covered hole he dug himself. The German advantage in numbers was real, and it was large. The German critical flaw was a plan that assumed those numbers would never actually have to be spent, and a doctrine that answered a checked assault by repeating it. There is a further piece the maps missed. Bouck's platoon was an intelligence and reconnaissance unit, which meant it carried the training and the radio to call and adjust artillery, and it did. The scouts reported the attack and worked the guns of the 99th against the ground below them, adding indirect fire to the direct fire already tearing at the paratrooper lines. The records on how much artillery reached the ridge that morning are thin, and the accounts differ on volume, so I won't overstate it. But the principle held. A recon screen that can see and can call is worth far more than its rifle count, because it borrows the weight of every gun within range. The paratroopers kept coming, because their orders and their doctrine both said to keep coming. On the ridge, the scouts kept firing because they had built the ground to make it possible. 2 armies on one narrow road, and the narrow road belonged to the 18 men who had learned it by heart. The first waves came uphill through gun smoke that would not clear in the cold, drifting low over the frozen field because there was no wind to move it. A paratrooper crossing that ground heard the .50 before he understood what it meant. The heavy hammering that reaches the body before the ear sorts it into individual rounds. The man beside him dropped and did not get up. The snow around the road took on a color it should not have. Cordite hung in the air with the resin smell of shattered pine, and above it all, the strange arithmetic of an attack that was supposed to already be over, and instead was killing everyone who stepped into the open. They had been told the Americans were a screen, and a screen was supposed to break. This one did not. From below the ridge, the assault looked like nothing the German confusion had prepared for. A Fallschirmjäger officer leading a section forward had every reason to expect thin, scattered fire from men already half in flight. Instead, the fire came in disciplined bursts, timed, aimed, arriving from positions he could not locate because the scouts fired and dropped and did not silhouette themselves against the sky. The road that intelligence had drawn as an open access to the Meuse had become a lane with walls of lead on either side of it. Bouck's men worked their weapons with the deliberateness of people who understand they cannot afford waste. The .50 caliber traversed and fell silent, and traversed again, feeding on the belts they had laid out ready, and the riflemen picked their targets the way a hunter picks, one man crossing the open at a time. There is a coldness to that kind of fighting that has nothing to do with the weather. You do not think about the men going down. You think about the next one, and the round in the chamber, and the range you memorized in November. The paratroopers reached the wire and the near ground and could not stay there. They fell back to the tree line, reformed, and came again, because their orders left no room for anything else, and the second wave learned the same lesson the first had paid for. What broke down in the German assault was comprehension, not courage. These were not raw conscripts. Elements of the division held combat veterans, and the men leading them knew their trade, knew how to fire and move and close on a strong point. But every rule they carried assumed a defender who could be pushed, and the ridge would not be pushed. The gap between what the plan promised and what the field delivered widened with every attack, and there is no more dangerous place for an army to stand than inside that gap, spending men against a problem the briefing said did not exist. Somewhere behind the paratroopers, the schedule was already bleeding. Peiper's armor sat on roads it could not use because the door at Lanzerath had not opened. Every hour the 18 scouts held was an hour. The whole northern shoulder of the offensive did not move, and the men on the ridge had no way of knowing they were doing anything so large. They knew the road in front of them, and the belts of ammunition beside them, and the fact that the Germans kept coming. American reports and German accounts agree on the shape of the morning, even where they differ on the count. Wave after wave, the same open ground, the same result. The Fallschirmjäger left men in the snow below the ridge in numbers that no screening action should ever produce, and still the seam did not give. You cannot brief soldiers out of the ground beneath their feet. The Germans had been promised an open road and walked into interlocking fire, and the longer the morning ran, the plainer it became to the men crossing that field that something on the ridge was very wrong with the picture they had been handed. They just could not yet see what. The belts for the .50 came in cans of 250 rounds, and by mid-morning, the empty cans were stacking up beside the gun position faster than any recon platoon was ever meant to burn through ammunition. That detail tells you more about the morning than any casualty figure. A screening platoon carries what it can dig in with, not what a fight of this size demands. And Bouck's men were spending their basic load against a regiment. They rationed the .50 when they could, and let the rifles do the work at the closer ranges. But the arithmetic of supply was already running against them, even as the arithmetic of the killing ground ran in their favor. The Germans came again in the late morning, and again after that. Each attack followed the shape of the last, up the open slope into the same interlocking fire, and each time the paratroopers left more men on the ground they could not hold. For the officers directing this from below, the problem was becoming a kind of insult. A Fallschirmjäger Regiment does not stall in front of a screen. Something on that ridge was fighting like a reinforced company, dug in with automatic weapons and covered approaches, and the volume of fire coming down the slope told the German commanders they faced a real defensive line with real strength behind it. It was a reasonable conclusion, and it was completely wrong, and being wrong about it cost them the whole morning. The German officers could not make the fire fit what was actually there. It was disciplined, which meant trained men, and it was accurate, which meant good positions and good sight lines, and it went on for hours, which meant either a large force or a smaller one that refused to break. Every indicator pointed at strength, and the strength was not there. 18 men were producing the signature of a company because they were cited to do exactly that, and because none of them ran. I keep coming back to that word, discipline, because it is the whole answer, and it is the least dramatic answer available. The paratroopers were not stopped by heroics in the movie sense. They were stopped by a small group of men who did not fire early, did not fire wild, did not abandon their holes when the pressure came, and did not let the size of what faced them turn into panic. Green troops in those foxholes would have opened up at the tree line, given away every position, and been flanked and rolled up inside an hour. These men waited. The waiting is the whole story. The German dead accumulated on the open ground in a way that should have told the officers something other than what they concluded. No screen produces this. A screen delays and withdraws, trading ground for time and preserving itself. What the paratroopers faced was a fixed line that would not trade anything, and so the German command kept committing to frontal assaults appropriate for cracking a fortified company, because that was the enemy they believed they had found. The disbelief runs through the German accounts of the day. The estimates of American strength on that ridge, formed under fire and repeated afterward, put far more men on it than were ever there. The scouts fired and reloaded and watched the tree line for the next wave. From their holes, the German attacks looked like what they were, brave men crossing killing ground on orders that no longer matched the field. The paratroopers came because the schedule behind them demanded it, and the schedule behind them was already broken by the very attacks meant to save it. That is the cruelty of the position they were in. Every wave they sent up the slope confirmed to their own command that the ridge held a strong force, which justified sending the next wave, which added to the dead, which deepened the false picture further. Late in the day, the paratroopers would finally change how they came at the ridge. By then, the morning was gone, and the morning was the thing the whole offensive could not spare. 15 miles behind the ridge, Joachim Peiper sat with the most powerful armored spearhead in the German West and nothing to drive it into. His Kampfgruppe was the tip of the entire 6th Panzer Army. Tanks and half-tracks and fuel trucks queued nose to tail on roads that could carry only one column at a time, and every one of those roads ran forward through the seam the paratroopers were supposed to have opened by mid-morning. Peiper had a schedule measured in hours. He had been told the infantry would clear the way before he ever reached it. Instead, he spent the day of the 16th stuck in a traffic jam of his own army's making, and the record of his frustration survives in his own post-war words, where he described the roads as clogged and the delay as the thing that ruined the timetable. The 18 men on the ridge bought that delay. They were not just killing paratroopers. They were holding a door shut on the whole northern shoulder of the offensive, And the harder the 9th Fallschirmjäger battered at the door, the longer it stayed shut, because every failed frontal wave was an hour Peiper's armor did not move. The fighting on the ridge ran into the afternoon and past it. Bouck's men had opened around dawn, and they were still in their holes as the light went, which meant they had been in continuous action for most of a short winter day, low on ammunition, some wounded, all of them past the point where adrenaline does the work, and into the place where only training keeps a man firing. The cold came into the foxholes with the dark. The smell by then was cordite gone stale, the Swedish reek of blood freezing in the snow below, and the raw ache of hands that had worked metal triggers in sub-freezing air since morning. Bouck himself, the 20-year-old who had lied his way into uniform at 14, radioed his battalion late in the day and was ordered to hold. He held. The end, when it came, did not come from the front. The paratroopers finally worked men close enough in the failing light to rush the positions, and in the dark, the fire discipline that had ruled the whole day could no longer see what it was killing. The platoon was overrun near nightfall. Most of the 18 were taken prisoner. Some were wounded. The accounts differ on the exact sequence of the last assault and on the final tally of German dead below the ridge, and I am not going to invent precision the sources do not support. The estimates run into the hundreds, and no clean figure survives. What survives is this. 18 men held the Losheim Gap for the better part of a full day against a reinforced regiment and cost the northern spearhead of the Ardennes offensive the one thing it could not replace: time. The Leibstandarte was built to reach the Meuse fast, before the Americans could react, before the weather cleared and the fighter bombers came. Speed was the entire concept. A blitzkrieg that moves at walking pace is just a lot of men and machines waiting to be bombed, and the whole northern route bogged down behind a schedule that broke on its first morning. Peiper eventually forced his own way forward and made his run, and it ended short of the river, hunted and out of fuel. The offensive that was supposed to split the Allied armies died in the snow weeks later, having never reached the objective the first day demanded. The men who inflicted that opening delay did not know they had done it. They knew the road and the belts and the tree line and the orders to hold. What they could not see from their holes was the armored army stalled behind the paratroopers, choking on a single ridge that 18 Americans refused to give up. By late afternoon, the light in the Ardennes was already going, the flat gray of a winter day sliding toward dark by 4, and with it went the one advantage the ridge had held all day. The scouts had won every fight so far on sightlines. They could see the open slope, and the paratroopers had to cross it, and the 50 and the rifles owned that ground as long as there was daylight to aim by. Take away the seeing, and the whole equation inverted. A man in a foxhole who cannot spot the enemy until the enemy is on the lip of the hole is no longer a defender. He is a target with good cover and nothing to shoot at. The ammunition was going too. You cannot fire a 50 all day off a basic load and expect the belts to last. The Germans finally did what they should have done hours earlier, which was stop feeding men up the open middle and work around the ends. In the failing light, they got parties into the dead ground on the flanks, close under the ridge where the scouts could not depress their weapons to reach them. And once the paratroopers were among the holes, the fight stopped being about fire discipline and became about grenades and close work in the dark. The positions that had been a wall by day became a line of isolated holes at night, each one blind, each one running out of the thing that had kept it dangerous. They took the platoon largely intact, which tells you the end came fast. Most of the 18 were captured. Several were wounded, some badly, and the accounts of who fell where in the last minutes do not fully agree. The sequence of a night overrun rarely survives clean in anyone's memory. What the sources do agree on is that the platoon did not scatter and did not surrender until it was physically overwhelmed, hole by hole, in the dark. The moment the whole day had been building toward arrived not on the ridge but behind the German lines, in the mouths of the men who had just won. The paratroopers who marched the prisoners back could not process what they had beaten. They had spent a regiment's worth of casualties against this ground. They expected to find a company at least, dug in deep, machine guns in depth, the kind of force whose fire they had been reading all day. Instead, they were escorting a handful of men, filthy and out of ammunition, some barely out of their teens. The German reaction survives in the post-war record, and it is the clearest proof of what the 18 had done. Their captors, the accounts hold, refused at first to believe that this was the entire force, that so few men had held them off for so long and cost them so dearly. It is the whole argument of this story stated by the only witnesses who mattered. You do not build an estimate of a strong defensive line out of 18 men unless those 18 men have made themselves impossible to count. The enemy's own shock, recorded in his own words after the fact, put more men on that ridge than were ever there, because the alternative, that a recon platoon had done this, did not fit anything the German officers understood about war. The prisoners went into captivity that night, and most of them survived it, which, given the road that same offensive was about to walk down at Malmedy, was no small thing. Bouck spent his 21st birthday, which fell that very day, as a prisoner of war. He would not receive proper recognition for decades. The platoon story sat in the records, uncounted and largely unread, while the larger battle swallowed the headlines. But the door they had held shut stayed shut long past the hour the whole northern offensive had budgeted for it, and the men who forced it open at last could not make their own arithmetic add up. The exchange rate on Lanzerath Ridge was the most lopsided of the entire first day, and it is worth saying the number plainly. The German casualty count against Bouck's platoon runs to around 92 killed and wounded, and the platoon lost not one man dead in the fight itself. That figure appears in the post-war reconstruction of the action, and I have seen it cited as low and cited as conservative, because a night overrun does not leave clean paperwork. Take even the low end. 92 of Germany's best-trained infantry, expended against 18 scouts who walked into captivity, essentially whole. That is not a firefight. It is a company of paratroopers deleted to buy a piece of ground the German army needed by lunchtime, and did not take until dark. Hold that image for a second. The best light infantry the Reich still had, men trained to drop behind enemy lines and fight cut off, crossing the same frozen slope again and again into a 50 caliber they could not silence, and leaving nearly 100 of their own in the snow to do it. The morning was the currency, and it was the one thing the whole northern offensive could not print more of. Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army had the main effort. It had the SS armor, the fuel priority, the shortest run to the Meuse, and its lead infantry ran into a ridge on the first morning and could not get past it on schedule, which meant Peiper's timetable slipped from hours into a full day, which meant the American units behind the line got the one thing an armored breakthrough is designed to deny them: time to wake up, time to move reserves, time to blow the bridges Peiper needed and hold the road junctions at Stavelot and Trois Ponts and Stoumont that would eventually strangle his Kampfgruppe short of the river. The Germans had done something like this before, in 1940, punching through the Ardennes against a French army that froze and did not react in time. The plan in 1944 assumed the Americans would freeze the same way. They did not, and the ridge is one of the reasons the clock never gave the Germans the head start the Manstein playbook had once handed them. So it comes back to the arithmetic of that single day. Every hour the 9th Fallschirmjäger spent dying in front of Lanzerath was an hour that rippled forward through a schedule built with no slack in it at all. Blitzkrieg has no margin. It works by staying inside the enemy's reaction time, and the moment it falls behind, it stops being a breakthrough and becomes a column of vehicles on narrow roads under a sky that is going to clear. When the weather broke on the 23rd, the fighter bombers came, and by then, Peiper was already finished, out of fuel, his men walking back on foot. The offensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp died having never crossed the Meuse. You cannot draw a straight line from 18 scouts to the failure of an army group. That would be too neat, and the Bulge failed for a dozen overlapping reasons. But you can say this without exaggeration. On the northern shoulder, where the main weight of the whole offensive was meant to fall, the first serious delay was inflicted by a recon platoon that was never supposed to fight at all, and the delay it inflicted was measured in the exact hours the plan could least afford to lose. The German officers who marched those prisoners to the rear counted more men on that ridge than were ever there, and they were not lying, and they were not stupid. They simply could not believe the truth. The evidence in front of them, the dead on the slope, the volume of fire, the whole shape of the day, added up to a defended line. 18 men had made themselves look like a battalion, and the enemy's own disbelief is the proof they left behind. So how does the action that stalled the northern shoulder of the Ardennes offensive vanish from the record for the better part of 40 years? The answer is dull, and it is the reason so many small unit actions disappear. The men who could testify to it spent the rest of the war in German prison camps. The regiment that owned them was fighting for its own survival further west. Nobody with the full picture wrote it up while the paperwork was fresh, and when Bouck and his scouts came home in 1945, they mostly did what that generation did, which was put it away and go to work. The story survived only in fragments, a line in a unit history here, a veteran's recollection somewhere else. It took a historian named John Eisenhower, son of the man who ran the whole theater, to pull the threads together in his book on the Bulge and put Lanzerath Ridge back where it belonged, in the timeline of December 16th. Once the action was reconstructed, the size of the injustice became obvious. 18 men one day, a company of German paratroopers destroyed, and almost nothing on any of their records to show for it. The correction came in 1981. The Army reviewed the action and awarded the platoon its due in a single ceremony, and the arithmetic of the medals is the whole point. Lyle Bouck received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. So did his forward artillery observer. 4 men in total took the Distinguished Service Cross, 5 more received the Silver Star, and the rest were awarded Bronze Stars with the Combat V. Every man in the platoon who fought on that ridge came out of the ceremony decorated. 18 men. Every one of them decorated for a single action. That made Bouck's Intelligence and Reconnaissance platoon the most decorated American platoon of the Second World War, a title earned by a unit that was never supposed to fight a stand-up battle at all. Scouts, observers, men whose job was to watch the enemy and report, holding a ridge against 500 paratroopers because they had dug the ground right and refused to leave it. And this is where the whole thing turns over. The offensive those 18 men helped stall was Germany's answer to overwhelming Allied air power and material. Hitler had timed the attack for foul December weather, precisely so the fighter bombers could not fly, betting that a fast armored thrust under a closed sky could reach Antwerp before the Americans recovered. The entire plan was a defense built against American strength, against the reaction time, the air power, the logistics that had been grinding the Reich down since Normandy. And it broke on the first morning, not against a fortified line or against air power, but against 18 scouts in reverse-slope foxholes who took the one commodity the whole scheme depended on. When the weather finally cleared and the fighter bombers came, Peiper's tanks were already abandoned in the snow, out of the fuel his men had never captured, and the army that built its last great offensive around beating the clock lost to a platoon that made it wait. Bouck himself became a chiropractor in Missouri after the war and lived into his late 80s, long enough to see his men recognized and to attend the reunions. The ground they held is a low wooded ridge above a Belgian village that most people drive past without a second look. The tangible thing, if you want to hold one image, is the Distinguished Service Cross itself, a bronze cross with an eagle at its center, the second highest decoration the United States awards for valor in combat. 4 of them went to men from a single 18-man platoon in one ceremony in 1981, for one day of work on one ridge in the Losheim Gap. The Germans who marched those men to the rear counted a battalion. The medals, pinned on decades late, told the truth of it.